The crack ran like a spider's web across the left lens, barely visible unless you caught it in the right light. Most would have called it a fatal flaw. Sarah Martinez called it Tuesday. The morning air hung thick with desert heat already building, even though dawn had barely broken over the training compound. Somewhere in the distance, a helicopter's rotors cut through the silence, ferrying another load of equipment to the forward observation posts scattered across the Nevada proving grounds. Sarah's fingers traced the edge of the scope's housing, feeling the familiar groove where metal had bent slightly inward from an impact she'd never reported. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The crack hadn't been there when she'd signed for the weapon 3 months ago. Now it was as much a part of her equipment as the worn grip tape and the sling she'd modified with parachute cord. Sarah had arrived at the Marine Corps Scout Sniper School evaluation course before most of the other candidates had even finished their coffee. The parking area outside the administrative building was still mostly empty, save for a few instructor vehicles and the shuttle that had dropped her off 20 minutes early. She preferred it that way. Early meant quiet, and quiet meant she could settle into the rhythm of the day without the noise of speculation and nervous energy that seemed to follow groups of competitive shooters wherever they gathered. The evaluation was nothing like the regular training rotations most Marines experienced. This was selection-level intensity compressed into 5 days of field exercises, written examinations, and shooting assessments that would determine who advanced to the actual Scout Sniper School and who returned to their units with a polite thank you and a notation in their service record. Only 12% of candidates typically made it through. Sarah had known those numbers when she submitted her application. She'd also known that in the past 3 years, exactly 2 women had been selected for the program. She shouldered her pack and walked toward the sign-in station, a folding table set up under a canvas shelter, where a staff sergeant with a clipboard was checking names against a roster. The man looked up as she approached, glanced at her gear, then back at his list. His expression was professionally neutral, the kind of face that had processed hundreds of hopeful Marines and watched most of them wash out before the week was over. "Martinez Sarah," she said, offering her identification card. He found her name, made a mark, and handed her a packet of papers sealed in plastic. "Rack assignment is Bravo 7. Gear inspection is at 0630. First exercise starts at 0800. Any questions?" "No, Staff Sergeant." "Good. Next." The barracks building was a standard 2-story concrete block structure that had housed Marines for probably 30 years. Sarah's assigned room was on the 2nd floor, a sparse space with 2 metal bunks, 2 wall lockers, and a small desk that looked like it had been assembled from surplus office furniture. Her roommate's gear was already arranged with military precision on the left side of the room. Sarah dropped her pack on the right bunk and began her own layout, checking each item against the packing list she'd memorized weeks ago. Her rifle case lay flat across the foot of the bed, the black polymer shell showing scratches from transport, but no serious damage. She popped the latches and lifted the foam insert to reveal the M40A6 she'd been issued for the evaluation. The weapon was older than some of the other candidates, with a barrel that showed the wear patterns of extensive use and a stock that had been refinished at least once. The scope mounted on top was where most people would have noticed the problem. The Leupold Mark IV had taken damage during a training exercise 2 months earlier when Sarah's previous unit had been conducting vehicle-mounted patrols. An improvised explosive device had detonated close enough to their Humvee to crack the windshield and throw everyone inside against whatever they'd been braced against. Sarah's rifle had been secured in the weapon rack, but the concussion had been enough to spider the left objective lens and slightly bend the scope housing. The armorer had logged the damage and ordered a replacement, but supply chain delays meant the new scope wouldn't arrive for weeks. Most Marines would have requested a different weapon. Sarah had asked to keep it. She'd spent the following weeks learning to work with the compromised optic, discovering that the crack created a subtle but predictable distortion that could be compensated for once you understood its pattern. At certain angles, it actually helped her estimate wind speed by breaking up the target image in ways that revealed air movement. At others, it forced her to rely more heavily on fundamentals like breathing control and trigger discipline. The bent housing meant the scope sat slightly off-axis, requiring a minor adjustment to her cheek weld that had become second nature after hundreds of practice rounds. That scope looks like it's been through a war. Sarah turned to see her roommate, a tall blonde woman with the kind of confident posture that suggested prior military experience. She was wearing a Desert Storm veteran t-shirt and had the lean build of someone who ran marathons for fun. "Kelly Reeves," the woman said, extending her hand. "Former Army. Did my time as a 68W before switching over to the Corps. You?" "Sarah Martinez. Infantry. 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines." She shook Kelly's hand, noting the firm grip and the calluses that marked someone who spent serious time at the range. Kelly nodded toward the rifle case. "That's your primary weapon for the eval?" "It is." "Mind if I ask why you're not using something in better condition?" "I saw some of the other candidates during gear issue yesterday, and most of them were carrying equipment that looked like it came straight from the factory." Sarah closed the rifle case and secured the latches. "This one, and I have an understanding." Kelly raised an eyebrow but didn't press the issue. She'd been in the military long enough to recognize when someone had their reasons for doing things a certain way. Instead, she returned to organizing her own equipment, laying out magazines and cleaning supplies with the kind of methodical approach that spoke to years of routine. The gear inspection at 0630 was conducted by a gunnery sergeant who moved through the ranks of assembled candidates like a quality control inspector in a factory. He checked packing lists, examined weapons, and made notes on a waterproof notepad that never seemed to leave his hand. When he reached Sarah, he spent extra time looking at her scope, turning the rifle to catch the crack in the morning light. "This weapon passed armorer inspection?" he asked. "Yes, gunnery sergeant. All documentation is in my packet." He checked the papers, found the relevant forms, and read through the damage assessment. The armorer had certified the weapon as functional despite the cosmetic damage to the optic, noting that accuracy was not significantly impacted and that the scope remained properly zeroed. The gunnery sergeant made a note and moved on without comment. The first exercise was a written examination covering ballistics, range estimation, and camouflage principles. Sarah finished early and used the extra time to review her notes on wind reading, a skill she'd discovered was more art than science, despite all the mathematical formulas they taught in basic marksmanship courses. The test scores were posted an hour later. She'd placed 3rd out of 28 candidates, behind Kelly and a former Marine Corps rifle team member named David Chen, who'd been shooting competitively since high school. The second exercise was more practical. Candidates were required to set up a shooting position from prone, estimate range to multiple targets, and calculate firing solutions based on current weather conditions. Sarah selected a spot near the left edge of the firing line, where a slight depression in the ground provided natural concealment. She deployed her rifle bipod and settled into position, adjusting her body until the reticle tracked smoothly when she shifted her weight. Through her scope, the crack was immediately visible, creating a jagged line that ran from the lower left quadrant toward the center of the reticle. A normal shooter might have found it distracting, but Sarah had learned to use it as a reference point. When the crack aligned with certain features of the target, she knew her hold was correct. When wind caused the image to shimmer, the distortion pattern helped her gauge velocity and direction. The targets were steel silhouettes placed at ranges from 400 to 800 meters, each one requiring a different firing solution based on distance, elevation, and the crosswind that had been building throughout the morning. Sarah worked through her calculations methodically, using the mil-dot reticle to estimate distances and the crack in her scope to confirm her wind readings. Her first shot struck center mass on the 400-meter target. Her second hit low on the 600-meter target, requiring a 1-minute elevation adjustment for the follow-up. By the time she engaged the 800-meter target, she'd found her rhythm. The instructors recorded each impact with spotting scopes and electronic sensors, building a database of performance metrics that would factor into the final selection decisions. Sarah's shooting scores were consistently in the top 5, though she noticed several other candidates achieving similar results with equipment that looked like it had been issued that morning. During the lunch break, she overheard a conversation between 2 male candidates who'd been struggling with the longer-range targets. "Did you see that girl with the busted scope?" one of them was saying. "How is she even hitting anything with that thing?" "Maybe she's just lucky," the other replied. "Wait until we get to the real shooting. Luck doesn't work at 1,000 meters." Sarah continued eating her meal without acknowledging the conversation. She'd heard similar comments throughout her military career, From drill instructors who questioned whether women belonged in combat roles, to peers who assumed her successes were statistical anomalies rather than the result of preparation and skill. The doubts of others had long since stopped affecting her performance, though they served as useful motivation when she needed to dig deeper during difficult training. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The afternoon brought individual interviews with the instructional staff, psychological evaluations designed to assess mental resilience and decision-making under stress. Sarah's interview was conducted by a master sergeant who'd been running sniper training programs for over a decade. He asked about her military experience, her reasons for pursuing the sniper school, and her assessment of her own strengths and weaknesses as a marksman. "I notice you're using a damaged scope," he said, consulting her evaluation file. "The armorer's report indicates the damage occurred during combat operations. Can you describe the circumstances?" Sarah explained the IED incident, the equipment damage, and her decision to continue training with a compromised optic rather than wait for a replacement. The master sergeant took notes and asked follow-up questions about how the damage affected her shooting and what adaptations she'd made to compensate. "Have you considered that using damaged equipment might be seen as a disadvantage during selection?" he asked. "I've considered it, Master Sergeant. But I've also considered that combat doesn't always provide perfect equipment. Learning to adapt to suboptimal conditions seems more valuable than relying on ideal circumstances." He made another note and moved on to questions about leadership experience and her plans following sniper school graduation. The interview lasted 45 minutes and ended with the standard closing statement about results being posted within 24 hours of the final exercise. That evening, Sarah cleaned her rifle in the barracks, disassembling the bolts and running cleaning patches through the barrel until they came out white. The damaged scope couldn't be field stripped like the weapon itself, but she used lens cleaning solution and a microfiber cloth to remove dust and fingerprints from the exterior surfaces. The crack couldn't be cleaned away, but she could ensure it didn't interfere with her ability to see through the optic clearly. Kelly watched from her own bunk, where she was performing similar maintenance on a weapon that looked like it had never been fired outside of a test facility. "You really think that scope is going to hold up for the rest of the week?" she asked. "It's held up this far. What if it gets worse? What if the crack spreads?" Sarah held the scope up to the light, examining the damage pattern. The crack had remained stable for 2 months, showing no signs of propagation or additional fracturing. The housing, while slightly bent, was still solidly mounted to the rifle's receiver. "Then I'll adapt to whatever changes." Kelly shook her head but smiled. "You're either very confident or very crazy. Sometimes those are the same thing." The next morning brought the long-range shooting assessment, the exercise that would eliminate more candidates than any other single event. The range extended to 1,200 meters, with targets placed at irregular intervals and varying elevations to simulate real-world shooting scenarios. Weather conditions included a 15-knot crosswind with gusts up to 20 knots, temperature inversion layers that would affect bullet trajectory, and the kind of heat shimmer that made target identification challenging even with perfect optics. Sarah drew firing order number 23 out of 28, meaning she would shoot near the end of the sequence when wind conditions would be at their most variable and when the psychological pressure of watching other candidates succeed or fail would be at its peak. She used the waiting time to study the other shooters, noting their shooting positions, their pace of fire, and the patterns of hits and misses that revealed information about current conditions. By the time her turn came, she'd developed a detailed mental map of how wind was moving across different sections of the range and where the most challenging shots would be. She approached the firing line with her rifle slung across her shoulder and her shooting kit organized in a small pack that contained ammunition, a range card, and a ballistic calculator that she rarely used but carried for backup. The range safety officer briefed her on the course of fire: 10 shots at targets ranging from 600 to 1,200 meters, with 30 seconds between shots and no opportunity for sighting shots or adjustments based on previous impacts. Each target would be exposed for exactly 2 minutes, requiring her to identify the target, calculate a firing solution, and engage before moving to the next target. There would be no coaching, no wind calls from spotters, and no second chances. Sarah settled into her shooting position and deployed her bipod, adjusting the legs until the rifle tracked naturally without requiring muscle tension to maintain alignment. She checked her shooting kit one final time, ensuring that ammunition was easily accessible and that her range card was positioned where she could reference it quickly. The damaged scope caught the morning light, creating brief flashes of rainbow-colored distortion where the crack split the image. Through the scope, the first target appeared as a dark silhouette against the desert background, wavering slightly in the heat mirage that rose from the sun-heated ground. The crack in her scope created a jagged line across the image, but she'd learned to use it as an additional reference point for measuring wind drift and target movement. At 600 meters, the crack aligned perfectly with the left edge of the target when she held center mass, providing a visual cue that confirmed her wind calculation. The range officer called the first target live, and Sarah began her shooting sequence. Her breathing slowed to match the rhythm she'd practiced thousands of times, each inhale and exhale timed to the natural oscillation of the rifle in her shoulder. The trigger broke cleanly on her first shot, sending a 175-grain match bullet downrange toward the steel target. Through her scope, she watched the impact flash appear slightly left of center, confirming her wind reading and validating the firing solution she'd calculated. The second target appeared at 800 meters, requiring a different elevation and a correction for the increased wind effect at longer range. Sarah made her adjustments and fired, this time achieving a center hit that rang the steel with a clear metallic ping that carried across the range. The third target, at 1,000 meters, presented a more challenging problem due to its placement on elevated ground that created unpredictable wind currents. She held her fire for several seconds, watching the heat mirage patterns and using the crack in her scope to gauge wind direction changes. When the conditions settled into a brief lull, she fired and scored another hit, this one slightly high but well within the scoring area. The pattern continued through the remaining targets, with Sarah adapting to each new challenge and using every available tool, including the damaged optic that other candidates might have seen as a liability. Her final target was positioned at the maximum range of 1,200 meters, a distance where even minor errors in calculation or execution would result in a complete miss. The wind had strengthened throughout the morning, creating complex patterns that required constant adjustment and careful timing. Sarah studied the target through her scope, noting how the crack distorted the image in ways that actually enhanced her ability to see wind-induced movement in the mirage. She calculated her firing solution twice, checking her math against the environmental conditions and the performance data from her previous shots. The elevation required was significant, demanding precise rifle handling and follow-through to ensure the bullet reached its intended target. When she was satisfied with her calculations, she settled into her final shooting position and controlled her breathing until the rifle became an extension of her body. The shot broke at the bottom of her natural respiratory pause, sending the bullet on a trajectory that would take nearly 2 seconds to reach the distant target. Through her scope, she watched the trace of the bullet's path, a barely visible disturbance in the air that marked its passage toward the steel silhouette. The impact came with a delayed ring that confirmed another successful hit, completing her course of fire with a perfect score. As she cleared her rifle and packed her equipment, Sarah noticed that several other candidates and instructors had gathered near the spotting scopes to observe the final shots. Their expressions ranged from professional interest to obvious surprise, though none of them approached her directly. She completed her administrative tasks and walked off the firing line with the same measured pace she'd maintained throughout the evaluation. The range officer who'd supervised her shooting made notes on his scorecard and spoke briefly into his radio, reporting her results to the command post where final scores were being tabulated. Sarah couldn't hear the conversation, but she noticed that he spent more time on his radio than he had with previous candidates. Kelly was waiting near the equipment turn-in station when Sarah arrived to secure her rifle and shooting kit. "How'd it go?" she asked. "Good enough," Sarah replied, though privately she was confident that her shooting had been among the best of the day. The damaged scope hadn't hindered her performance. If anything, it had provided unique advantages that other candidates lacked. "I heard some of the instructors talking," Kelly said quietly. "They're saying someone just shot a perfect score with damaged equipment. I'm guessing that was you." Sarah finished packing her gear and shouldered her rifle case. "Scores aren't posted yet." "No, but word travels fast around here, especially when someone does something that surprises the instructional staff." They walked back toward the barracks together, passing groups of other candidates who were discussing their own performance and speculating about the final results. Sarah listened to fragments of conversation that revealed the stress and uncertainty that came with high-stakes evaluation. Some candidates were confident, Others were clearly worried about borderline performance that might not be sufficient for selection. "Can I ask you something?" Kelly said as they climbed the stairs to their room. "Sure. Why didn't you just request a replacement scope? I mean, I get the adaptation thing, but you had to know that using damaged equipment would raise questions." Sarah stopped at their door and considered the question. It wasn't the first time someone had asked her about her equipment choices, and it probably wouldn't be the last. "Because perfect conditions don't exist in combat," she said finally. "Equipment breaks, weather changes, and missions don't get postponed because your gear isn't optimal. I'd rather learn to excel with imperfect tools than depend on everything being exactly right." Kelly nodded slowly. "That's either brilliant or completely insane. I've been told those aren't mutually exclusive." That evening, Sarah performed her usual rifle maintenance routine, cleaning and inspecting every component of her weapon system. The scope remained securely mounted despite the damage, and the crack showed no signs of worsening. She made notes in her shooting journal, recording environmental conditions, ammunition performance, and lessons learned from the day's exercises. The final day of evaluation would include additional shooting assessments, a comprehensive written examination, and individual meetings with the selection board. Sarah felt confident about her performance so far, but she also knew that confidence could be dangerous if it led to complacency. The instructors had designed the program to eliminate candidates who couldn't maintain high standards under pressure, and the final day would likely present new challenges specifically intended to test mental resilience. As she prepared for sleep, Sarah caught her reflection in the window of their room. Outside, the Nevada desert stretched away into darkness, a landscape that had tested Marines for generations and would continue testing them long after her evaluation was complete. The cracked scope resting beside her bunk had become more than just damaged equipment. It was a reminder that adaptation and persistence often mattered more than perfect conditions. Tomorrow would bring the conclusion of her evaluation and the answer to whether her unconventional approach had been sufficient to earn a place in one of the military's most demanding training programs. But tonight she was satisfied with her performance and confident that she demonstrated the skills and mindset that the instructors were looking for, regardless of what equipment she'd used to do it. The crack in her scope had taught her that perfection wasn't always necessary for precision, and that sometimes the greatest advantages came from learning to work with limitations rather than waiting for ideal circumstances. It was a lesson that would serve her well in sniper school and beyond. 3 months before the evaluation, Sarah had been lying in a hospital bed at Camp Pendleton, staring at the ceiling tiles and trying to ignore the ringing in her ears that the doctor said might be permanent. The IED blast had been close enough to turn their armored vehicle into a carnival ride, throwing everyone inside against whatever wasn't bolted down. Her rifle had survived better than she had, sustaining only the cracked scope while she'd earned a concussion, 3 cracked ribs, and a collection of bruises that painted her torso in shades of purple and yellow. The corpsman who'd checked on her that first night had been a soft-spoken Navy petty officer with kind eyes and hands that moved gently when examining injuries. He'd asked about her pain levels, documented her symptoms, and made notes about the persistent headaches that came and went like storm clouds. When he'd finished his assessment, he'd noticed her rifle case beside the bed and commented that she was lucky the weapon hadn't been more seriously damaged. Sarah had asked to see it, and the corpsman had helped her sit up carefully, supporting her back while she opened the case and examined the scope. The crack had been immediately visible, a spider web of fractured glass that caught the fluorescent lighting and split it into prismatic fragments. Most people would have seen it as damage. Sarah had seen it as an opportunity to learn something new. The recovery process had been slow and frustrating, filled with physical therapy sessions and cognitive assessments designed to ensure that the concussion hadn't caused lasting neurological damage. Sarah had passed every test, but the doctors had kept her on limited duty for 6 weeks, restricting her from training activities that might involve head trauma or exposure to loud noises. The limitation had been maddening for someone accustomed to daily physical training and regular marksmanship practice. During those weeks of restricted activity, Sarah had spent hours studying ballistics manuals, wind reading guides, and marksmanship theory that she'd previously learned through practical application. She'd read about the psychological aspects of precision shooting, the physiological effects of stress on motor control, and the mathematical principles underlying external ballistics. The knowledge had been useful, but it wasn't the same as actually pulling triggers and watching bullets impact targets. When she'd finally been cleared for light duty, Her first stop had been the base armory to inspect her rifle and assess the scope damage. The armorer, a grizzled staff sergeant with 20 years of experience maintaining Marine Corps weapons, had examined the scope thoroughly and delivered his assessment with characteristic bluntness. "The crack doesn't affect the reticle integrity," he'd explained, pointing to the undamaged crosshairs that remained perfectly aligned despite the fractured glass. "The housing is slightly bent, but it's still solid. Mechanically, the scope is functional. Optically, you'll have some distortion, but nothing that should prevent accurate shooting." Sarah had asked about repair options, and the armorer had shaken his head. Replacement was the only viable solution, he'd said, but supply chain issues meant waiting several weeks for a new scope to arrive. Most Marines in her situation would have been issued a temporary replacement weapon, but Sarah had requested permission to keep her rifle and work with the damaged optic. The request had raised eyebrows, but her chain of command had approved it after she'd demonstrated that she could still achieve acceptable accuracy despite the equipment limitations. The first time she'd looked through the cracked scope at the range, the distortion had been disorienting. The fractured glass created multiple images of the same target, like looking through a broken kaleidoscope. Her initial shots had been inconsistent, grouping poorly as she struggled to determine which image represented the actual target location. But Sarah had always been methodical in her approach to problem-solving, and she'd approached the damaged scope like a puzzle that needed to be solved, rather than a limitation that needed to be endured. She'd started by mapping the distortion pattern, firing groups at different ranges and noting how the crack affected her perception of target placement. At 100 meters, the distortion was minimal, barely noticeable unless she looked for it specifically. At 300 meters, it became more pronounced, creating a slight doubling effect that required her to identify which image was primary. At 500 meters and beyond, the crack created complex visual patterns that initially seemed random, but gradually revealed themselves to be predictable and useful. The breakthrough had come during a late afternoon training session, when the light was hitting her scope at exactly the right angle to make the crack visible as a distinct line across her field of view. Sarah had realized that she could use the crack as an additional reference point, similar to the mil dots on her reticle, but oriented differently. When the crack aligned with certain features of her target, it indicated specific hold-off points for wind and elevation corrections. Over the following weeks, she'd developed a system for using the damaged scope that was actually more precise than her previous shooting with undamaged equipment. The crack forced her to slow down and be more deliberate with each shot, eliminating the tendency to rush through her shooting sequence. The distortion patterns helped her detect wind movement that might have been invisible through clear glass. The slightly bent housing changed her cheek weld in a way that improved her natural point of aim. What had started as equipment damage had evolved into a competitive advantage, but only because Sarah had invested the time and effort to understand how to work with the limitations rather than against them. She'd kept detailed notes throughout the process, documenting what worked and what didn't, building a comprehensive understanding of how to maximize performance with suboptimal equipment. The knowledge had served her well during subsequent training exercises, where her shooting scores had actually improved compared to her performance before the IED incident. Her unit commanders had noticed the improvement and had begun using her as an example of how Marines could adapt to equipment failures in combat situations. When the opportunity to apply for Scout Sniper School had arisen, Sarah's shooting scores and her demonstrated ability to excel under challenging conditions had made her a natural candidate. The application process had been rigorous, requiring physical fitness assessments, marksmanship evaluations, and interviews with senior non-commissioned officers who would determine whether she possessed the mental attributes necessary for success in the demanding training program. Sarah had performed well in all areas, but she'd known that the real test would come during the evaluation week, where candidates would be assessed under realistic field conditions. Now, lying in her bunk on the night before the final day of evaluation, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The cracked scope beside her had become more than just a piece of damaged equipment. It was a reminder that setbacks could become advantages if approached with the right mindset. The other candidates might have newer gear and more conventional training backgrounds, but Sarah had something they lacked: the knowledge that excellence didn't require perfect conditions. The final morning began before dawn with a comprehensive physical fitness assessment that included a timed run, obstacles course, and strength evaluations. Sarah had always been naturally athletic, But the months of recovery and adaptation following her injury had given her a deeper appreciation for the connection between physical and mental performance. She completed the assessments within the top tier of candidates, though not at the very top of the rankings. The morning's second event was a stalking exercise that required candidates to move undetected across open terrain to within shooting range of observer positions, manned by instructors with high-powered optics. The challenge was to reach the designated firing positions without being spotted, engage simulated targets with blank ammunition, and extract without detection. Candidates who were observed during any phase of the exercise would be immediately eliminated from consideration. Sarah studied the terrain carefully before beginning her movement, identifying covered routes and natural concealment that would mask her approach. The damage scope on her rifle actually provided an advantage during the stalking phase, since its unusual appearance helped break up the straight lines that observers typically looked for when scanning for hidden shooters. She moved slowly and deliberately, taking advantage of shadows and ground features to remain invisible. The simulated engagement went smoothly, with Sarah reaching her designated position undetected and successfully engaging multiple targets with blank ammunition. Her extraction was equally successful, covering the return route without being spotted by the instructor observers. When she reached the rally point, she learned that less than half of the candidates had completed the exercise without being detected. Several had been spotted during their approach movements, and others had been identified during their simulated engagements. The afternoon brought the final shooting assessment, a complex scenario that combined long-range precision shooting with time pressure and environmental challenges. Candidates would be required to engage multiple targets at various ranges while dealing with changing wind conditions, limited ammunition, and strict time constraints. The exercise was designed to simulate the kind of shooting situations that operational snipers might encounter in combat environments. Sarah's shooting lane included targets at ranges from 400 to 1,100 meters, each one requiring different calculations and adjustments based on current conditions. The wind had picked up significantly since morning, creating challenging shooting conditions that would test every candidate's ability to read environmental factors and make accurate adjustments. She checked her equipment one final time, ensuring that her rifle was properly zeroed and that her ammunition was sorted by lot number for consistency. The cracked scope caught the afternoon sunlight as she settled into her shooting position, creating the familiar pattern of distorted reflections that she'd learned to interpret over months of practice. Through the damaged optic, the first target appeared as multiple overlapping images, but Sarah's trained eye immediately identified the primary image and aligned her reticle accordingly. The crack in the glass created a reference line that helped her gauge wind drift and confirm her hold-off calculations. Her first shot struck the 400-meter target center mass, validating her wind reading and confirming that her rifle was performing consistently. The second target, positioned at 650 meters on elevated ground, required significant adjustments for both range and angle. Sarah made her calculations quickly but carefully, using the crack in her scope to verify her wind call before firing. The bullet impacted slightly left of center, still within the scoring area but indicating that the wind was stronger than she'd initially estimated. She adjusted her hold-off for the third target and achieved a center hit at 800 meters, finding her rhythm and settling into the kind of focused concentration that made everything else fade into background noise. The damage scope had become transparent to her awareness, no longer a limitation but simply another tool that provided useful information about shooting conditions. The fourth target was positioned at the maximum range of 1,100 meters, a distance that required precise calculations and perfect execution to achieve a hit. Sarah studied the target through her scope, noting how the heat mirage and wind patterns affected the visual image. The crack in her scope actually helped her see subtle variations in the mirage that indicated wind direction changes, giving her information that candidates with undamaged equipment might miss. She calculated her firing solution twice, checking her work against the environmental conditions and her previous shots. The elevation adjustment required was substantial, and the wind correction was equally significant. When she was confident in her calculations, she settled into her final shooting position and controlled her breathing until the rifle became perfectly steady. The shot broke cleanly, sending the bullet on a long arc toward the distant target. Through her scope, Sarah watched the trace of the bullet's path, a barely visible disturbance in the air that marked its trajectory. The impact came after what seemed like an eternity, a sharp metallic ring that confirmed another successful hit and completed her shooting sequence with a perfect score. As she cleared her weapon and packed her equipment, Sarah noticed that several instructors had gathered near the observation post to discuss the day's results. Their conversation was too distant to hear clearly, but their body language suggested animated discussion about candidate performance. She completed her administrative tasks and prepared to turn in her equipment for the final time. The equipment turn-in process was conducted by the same armorer who had initially issued her rifle at the beginning of the evaluation. He examined the weapon carefully, checking for damage and verifying that all components were present and functional. When he reached the scope, he spent extra time examining the crack and the slightly bent housing. "Your scope took some abuse," he commented, adjusting the mounting screws and checking the alignment, "but it's held together better than I expected." Sarah nodded but didn't elaborate on how she learned to work with the damaged equipment. The armorer finished his inspection and made notes on his paperwork, officially returning the weapon to inventory despite its cosmetic damage. The final administrative phase included individual debriefings with the instructional staff, exit interviews designed to assess each candidate's experience and gather feedback about the evaluation process. Sarah's interview was conducted by the same master sergeant who had questioned her about her equipment choices earlier in the week. He reviewed her performance scores, which were consistently in the top tier across all measured areas. "Your shooting scores are impressive," he said, consulting a folder thick with evaluation reports, "especially considering the equipment limitations you were working with. Can you walk me through your thought process during the final shooting assessment?" Sarah described her approach to reading wind conditions, calculating firing solutions, and using environmental cues to make accurate shots. She explained how she'd adapted her shooting technique to work with the damaged scope, and how the limitations had actually improved certain aspects of her marksmanship. The master sergeant took detailed notes and asked follow-up questions about her training methods and her plans for continued development. When the interview concluded, he offered a comment that surprised her. "In 15 years of running this program, I've never seen a candidate achieve those kinds of results with damaged equipment. It suggests a level of adaptability and problem-solving ability that we value highly in operational snipers." Sarah thanked him for the feedback but remained cautious about interpreting his comments as an indication of her selection status. She'd seen confident candidates fail at the last moment due to administrative issues or final evaluations that revealed previously hidden deficiencies. The waiting period between the completion of evaluations and the announcement of results was always the most stressful part of any selection process. Candidates gathered in small groups, discussing their performance and speculating about who might be selected for the training program. Sarah participated in the conversations but tried to avoid the kind of detailed analysis that could lead to false confidence or unnecessary anxiety. Kelly found her that evening as she was finishing her final equipment packing, preparing for departure the following day regardless of the selection results. If they chose me for the program, she would return in a few weeks to begin the full Scout Sniper School curriculum. If not, she would report back to her unit with valuable experience and lessons learned that would benefit her future military service. "You seem pretty calm for someone waiting to find out if they made it into one of the most selective programs in the Corps," Kelly observed, settling onto her own bunk with a cup of coffee that had probably been brewing since morning. "Worrying about things I can't control doesn't change the outcome," Sarah replied, folding her clothing with the kind of precision that had become second nature after years of military service. "I did my best with what I had. The rest is up to them." Kelly nodded but looked skeptical. Easy to say, harder to feel that way. "I've been checking my phone every 10 minutes like they're going to text me the results." Sarah finished packing and secured her personal items in her travel bag. The damaged scope had been returned with her rifle, but she'd taken detailed photos and measurements that would help her request similar equipment if she was selected for the full training program. The adaptation techniques she'd developed would be useful, regardless of what equipment she was issued in the future. The results were posted the following morning on a bulletin board outside the administrative building, a simple list of names that represented months of preparation and a week of intensive evaluation. Sarah approached the board with the same measured pace she'd maintained throughout the evaluation, neither hurrying anxiously nor hanging back fearfully. Her name appeared third on the list of 7 selected candidates, positioned between Kelly Reeves and David Chen, the competitive shooter who had consistently performed at the top of every assessment. Out of 28 original candidates, only 7 had been chosen to continue to the full training program. The selection rate was actually higher than the historical average, suggesting that the current group of candidates had been exceptionally well qualified. Sarah felt a quiet satisfaction at seeing her name on the list, validation that her unconventional approach and adaptation to equipment limitations had been recognized as strengths rather than weaknesses. The damaged scope had become a symbol of her ability to excel under challenging conditions, a skill that would serve her well in the demanding training that lay ahead. Kelly approached the board a few minutes later, letting out a quiet cheer when she found her own name on the selection list. The two women congratulated each other with the kind of understated celebration that was appropriate for military professionals who had achieved an important milestone, but knew that greater challenges lay ahead. The departure process was handled efficiently, with selected candidates receiving reporting instructions and preparation guidance for the full training program that would begin in 6 weeks. Those who had not been selected were offered constructive feedback and encouragement to reapply for future selection cycles if they remained interested and qualified. As Sarah boarded the transport vehicle that would take her to the airport, she carried with her not just the satisfaction of selection, but also the knowledge that she had proven something important about the relationship between adaptability and excellence. The cracked scope had taught her that limitations could become advantages when approached with creativity and persistence, a lesson that would influence her approach to challenges throughout her military career. The vehicle pulled away from the training facility as the morning sun climbed higher over the Nevada desert, beginning Sarah's journey back to her home unit, where she would prepare for the next phase of her sniper training. Behind her, the range where she had demonstrated that damaged equipment could produce perfect results remained quiet, waiting for the next group of candidates who would test themselves against its demanding standards. The cracked scope was gone, returned to inventory where it would likely be replaced and forgotten, but the lessons it had taught would remain with Sarah forever. Sometimes the greatest advantages came not from having perfect tools, but from learning to excel with whatever tools were available. It was a principle that would guide her through sniper school and beyond, a reminder that adaptation and persistence often mattered more than ideal conditions. 6 weeks later, Sarah stood at the edge of the Quantico training grounds, her duffel bag at her feet, and the Virginia morning air thick with humidity that clung to her uniform like a second skin. The Marine Corps Scout Sniper School occupied a sprawling complex of ranges, classrooms, and field training areas that had been testing Marines for decades. Somewhere in the distance, the sharp crack of rifle fire punctuated the morning quiet, a sound that would become as familiar as her own heartbeat over the next 13 weeks. The other selected candidates had arrived throughout the morning, each one carrying the quiet confidence that came with having survived the evaluation process. Kelly appeared at Sarah's shoulder, her own gear organized with the same meticulous attention to detail that had marked her performance during selection. David Chen was conferring with 2 other candidates near the administrative building. Their conversation focused on the training schedule and the academic requirements that would supplement the practical instruction. Sarah had spent the intervening weeks preparing for this moment, studying field manuals and maintaining her physical conditioning while working through her regular duties with her unit. Her chain of command had been supportive of her selection, adjusting her work schedule to accommodate additional training time and ensuring that she would be able to focus entirely on the sniper program once it began. The damaged scope from her evaluation had been replaced with a standard-issue optic, but Sarah had requested permission to continue training with damaged equipment when it became available. The request had puzzled her unit armorer, who couldn't understand why anyone would want to practice with suboptimal gear when superior equipment was readily available. Sarah had explained her reasoning in terms of combat readiness and adaptability, arguing that learning to excel with imperfect tools would make her a more effective sniper in real-world situations where equipment failures were always possible. The armorer had reluctantly agreed to her request, though he'd made it clear that he thought her approach was unnecessarily difficult. The first week of sniper school was designed to establish baselines and introduce candidates to the academic requirements that would parallel their practical training throughout the program. Sarah found herself in classroom sessions covering ballistics theory, meteorology, camouflage principles, and the psychological aspects of precision shooting. The instructors were experienced staff non-commissioned officers who had operational experience as snipers and brought real-world perspective to their teaching. One of the instructors, Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez, had noticed Sarah's equipment preferences during the initial gear issue and had questioned her about her reasons for requesting non-standard items. She'd explained her philosophy about training with limitations, and he'd listened with the kind of professional interest that suggested he'd encountered similar approaches before. His response had been characteristically direct. Prove that your method works better than standard procedures, and we'll support it. Fail to meet standards, and you'll use regulation equipment like everyone else. The challenge had been exactly what Sarah had hoped for, an opportunity to demonstrate that her unconventional approach could produce superior results when properly applied. She'd accepted the terms and had begun her training with a determination to exceed every standard using whatever equipment was available, regardless of its condition or limitations. The academic coursework was intensive, requiring several hours of study each evening in addition to the full days of practical instruction. Sarah had always been a strong student, but the technical material covered in sniper school demanded a level of precision and attention to detail that exceeded anything she'd encountered in her previous military education. She studied ballistics coefficients, atmospheric pressure variations, and the mathematical relationships that governed external ballistics, with the same methodical approach she'd applied to learning her damage scope. The practical training began with fundamental marksmanship instruction, designed to ensure that all candidates possessed the basic skills necessary for precision shooting. Sarah's shooting scores were consistently high, though not dramatically superior to those of her classmates. The real differences became apparent during the more advanced exercises that introduced variables like wind, range estimation, and time pressure. During a particularly challenging exercise involving multiple targets at unknown distances, Sarah found herself paired with a candidate named Marcus Williams, a former infantry marine who had earned his selection through exceptional physical performance and solid shooting skills. Marcus was using state-of-the-art equipment, including a newly issued scope with advanced ballistic computation capabilities, electronic range-finding features, and atmospheric sensors that automatically adjusted for environmental conditions. Sarah was using a deliberately damaged rifle that the instructors had provided at her request, complete with a scope that had been professionally cracked in a controlled manner to simulate combat damage. The weapon was functional, but far from optimal, requiring constant adaptation and compensation for its limitations. Most candidates would have seen it as a significant handicap, but Sarah approached it as an opportunity to refine the techniques she'd developed during her preparation for sniper school. The exercise required each team to engage targets at ranges from 500 to 1,200 meters within strict time limits, with scoring based on both accuracy and speed of engagement. Marcus relied heavily on his electronic systems, using the rangefinder to determine distances and the ballistic computer to calculate firing solutions. His approach was efficient and effective, producing good results with minimal mental calculation or environmental assessment. Sarah's approach was fundamentally different, requiring her to estimate ranges visually, read wind conditions through observation of natural indicators, and calculate firing solutions using mental math and field expedient techniques. The cracked scope forced her to work harder for each shot, but it also provided unique advantages in terms of wind reading and target identification that electronic systems couldn't match. When the exercise concluded, both teams had achieved similar accuracy scores, but Sarah's times were actually faster than Marcus's, despite using more primitive equipment. The instructors noted the performance difference and questioned both candidates about their methods and decision-making processes during the exercise. Marcus explained his reliance on electronic systems and the advantages they provided in terms of accuracy and consistency. His approach was textbook correct, following established procedures and maximizing the capabilities of modern military technology. The instructors nodded approvingly and made notes about his systematic approach to problem-solving. Sarah's explanation was more complex, involving her techniques for reading environmental conditions without instruments, estimating ranges using visual cues, and using equipment limitations as sources of additional information rather than simple obstacles to overcome. She demonstrated how the crack in her scope helped her detect wind variations that might be invisible through clear glass, and how the damage reticle forced her to rely more heavily on fundamental shooting skills that were more reliable than electronic systems in extreme conditions. The instructors listened with obvious interest, asking detailed questions about her methods and requesting demonstrations of specific techniques. Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez was particularly intrigued by her approach to wind reading using the distorted optic, noting that her method provided information that might not be available through conventional techniques. "Your approach is unconventional," he commented after observing her demonstration, "but the results suggest that you're onto something valuable. The question is whether you can teach these techniques to other Marines, and whether they're reliable enough for operational use." Sarah had expected that question and had prepared a detailed response about the training methods that would be required to develop similar skills in other shooters. She explained that the techniques weren't necessarily difficult to learn, but they required a different mindset about equipment and a willingness to spend significantly more time developing fundamental skills rather than relying on technological solutions. The conversation had attracted attention from other instructors and several of the more experienced candidates who were interested in alternative approaches to precision shooting. Sarah found herself conducting informal teaching sessions during evening study periods, sharing her methods with classmates who were curious about her unconventional techniques. Kelly was among the most interested students, having observed Sarah's performance during selection and recognizing the potential advantages of her approach. She began experimenting with deliberately limiting her own equipment capabilities, covering portions of her scope, or removing electronic aids to force herself to rely more heavily on fundamental skills. The results were initially mixed, with Kelly's accuracy decreasing as she adjusted to working without her usual technological assistance. But over several weeks of practice, her performance began to improve as she developed greater sensitivity to environmental conditions and more confidence in her ability to make accurate shots without electronic confirmation. Other candidates were less receptive to Sarah's methods, arguing that deliberately handicapping themselves with inferior equipment was counterproductive when superior tools were available. Their position was understandable and represented the conventional wisdom about military equipment and training. Most military doctrine emphasized using the best available technology to maximize effectiveness and minimize risk. Sarah understood their perspective but maintained that over-reliance on technology could become a vulnerability when systems failed or were unavailable. She pointed to historical examples of military operations where equipment failures had compromised mission success and argued that developing redundant capabilities using low-tech methods was a form of insurance against technological vulnerabilities. The debate became a recurring theme throughout the training program, with candidates and instructors engaging in ongoing discussions about the optimal balance between technological capability and fundamental skill development. Sarah found herself at the center of these discussions, defending her approach while acknowledging the valid points raised by those who favored conventional methods. The middle weeks of the program introduced more complex scenarios that combined shooting skills with stalking, camouflage, and fieldcraft techniques. Sarah's equipment limitations became less relevant during these exercises, since the emphasis was on movement, concealment, and observation rather than pure shooting performance. She excelled in these areas, demonstrating natural aptitude for the patient, methodical approach that effective sniping required. During a week-long field exercise that simulated extended operations in enemy territory, Sarah was paired with David Chen in a two-man sniper team, responsible for conducting reconnaissance and precision engagement missions across a large training area. The exercise was designed to test every skill the candidates had learned, from camouflage and movement to long-range shooting and mission planning. David had initially been skeptical of Sarah's equipment choices, arguing that their mission success might be compromised by her insistence on using damaged gear. But as the exercise progressed, he began to appreciate the advantages that her methods provided in terms of adaptability and resourcefulness. When his electronic rangefinder failed during a critical engagement, Sarah's ability to estimate distances accurately using visual techniques proved invaluable. Their partnership evolved throughout the exercise, with David learning to incorporate some of Sarah's low-tech methods into his own shooting routine, while Sarah benefited from his systematic approach to mission planning and target analysis. By the end of the week, they had developed an effective working relationship that combined the best aspects of both their approaches. The final phase of sniper school focused on advanced shooting techniques and combat applications that would prepare graduates for operational assignments. The training scenarios became increasingly realistic, incorporating stress factors like time pressure, physical fatigue, and simulated combat conditions. Sarah's training with damaged equipment proved particularly valuable during these exercises, since the additional challenges she'd been practicing with had prepared her for exactly the kind of suboptimal conditions that the advanced scenarios presented. During the final shooting assessment, candidates were required to engage multiple targets at various ranges while dealing with challenging weather conditions, equipment limitations, and strict time constraints. The exercise was designed to simulate the kind of shooting situations that operational snipers might encounter in combat environments where everything that could go wrong probably would. Sarah approached the final assessment with quiet confidence, knowing that her months of training with deliberately damaged equipment had prepared her for exactly this kind of challenge. The rifle she'd been issued for the test was in perfect condition, a stark contrast to the damaged weapons she'd been using throughout the program. Through the crystal-clear scope, targets appeared sharp and undistorted, without the familiar reference points that the cracked optics had provided. The change was initially disorienting, requiring Sarah to adjust her shooting technique to work with equipment that was actually superior to what she'd been training with. She found herself missing some of the visual cues that the damaged scopes had provided, particularly for wind reading and range estimation. But her fundamental skills had been strengthened by months of working with limitations, and she quickly adapted to the improved equipment. Her performance on the final assessment was exceptional, achieving perfect scores on accuracy while maintaining some of the fastest engagement times in the class. The instructors noted her results with obvious satisfaction, validating the unconventional training approach that had generated significant discussion throughout the program. Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez approached Sarah after the assessment, carrying a folder that contained her complete training record and performance evaluations. "Your final scores are impressive," he said, opening the folder and reviewing the accumulated data from 13 weeks of intensive training. "More importantly, you've demonstrated something that we don't see very often in this program." Sarah waited for him to continue, uncertain about what specific aspect of her performance he was referring to. The training had been challenging, but she'd never felt that her approach was particularly revolutionary or unusual. She'd simply applied the same methodical problem-solving skills that had served her throughout her military career. "Most graduates of this program are excellent technicians," Rodriguez continued. "They can use their equipment effectively and achieve good results under standard conditions, but you've demonstrated something more valuable: the ability to excel regardless of conditions or equipment limitations. That's the kind of adaptability that separates competent snipers from exceptional ones." The comment was gratifying, but Sarah remained focused on the practical implications of completing the program successfully. She would soon receive orders to an operational unit where her training would be applied in real-world situations with actual consequences. The damaged scopes and artificial limitations of the training environment would be replaced by the genuine challenges of combat operations. The graduation ceremony was conducted with the kind of military precision that marked all significant Marine Corps events. Family members and unit representatives attended to witness the completion of one of the Corps' most demanding training programs. Sarah's parents had flown in from California, proud of their daughter's achievement but still somewhat puzzled by her decision to pursue such a specialized and dangerous military occupation. During the reception following the ceremony, Sarah was approached by several officers who had heard about her unconventional training methods and were interested in incorporating similar techniques into their unit's training programs. She found herself explaining her approach to adapt to equipment limitations and discussing the potential applications for other types of military training. One officer, a major who commanded a reconnaissance unit, was particularly interested in Sarah's methods for developing fundamental skills without relying on electronic systems. He argued that her approach could be valuable for special operations forces who might need to operate with minimal equipment in environments where electronic systems were unavailable or compromised. The conversation continued for over an hour, covering topics ranging from training methodology to equipment procurement and the philosophical differences between technology-dependent and skill-dependent approaches to military capabilities. Sarah found herself articulating ideas that she'd never fully formulated before, drawing on her experiences during sniper school to develop a more comprehensive understanding of her own methods. As the reception wound down and families began departing, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The cracked scope that had started her exploration of alternative methods was long gone, but the lessons it had taught her would remain relevant throughout her military career. She'd learned that limitations could become advantages when approached with creativity and persistence, and that the most reliable capabilities were often the ones that didn't depend on perfect conditions or ideal equipment. Her orders would take her to a Marine expeditionary unit that would deploy overseas within 6 months, providing her with opportunities to apply her training in operational environments. The real test of her methods would come not in the controlled conditions of training exercises, but in the unpredictable and often chaotic environment of actual combat operations. But Sarah felt confident that her preparation had been thorough, and that her approach to precision shooting would prove effective regardless of the challenges she encountered. The cracked scope had been the beginning of her education in adaptability and resourcefulness, but sniper school had provided the advanced training necessary to apply those lessons at the highest level of military professionalism. As she packed her graduation materials and prepared for the transition to her new assignment, Sarah carried with her not just the technical skills of a qualified sniper, but also a philosophy about excellence that would influence every aspect of her military service. Sometimes the greatest advantages came not from having perfect tools, but from learning to excel with whatever tools were available. The helicopter settled onto the landing zone with a characteristic thump of rotor blades biting desert air, kicking up a cloud of fine sand that infiltrated every piece of equipment despite careful protective measures. Sarah adjusted her pack and moved toward the aircraft with the measured stride that had become her trademark, her rifle case secured across her back, and her gear organized with the precision that 18 months of operational deployments had refined to an art form. The mission briefing had been straightforward in its complexity. A high-value target had been identified in a compound approximately 800 meters from the nearest viable shooting position, requiring a precision engagement in an environment where civilian casualties were unacceptable and extraction would need to be immediate following the shot. Intelligence reports indicated that the target would be visible for approximately 30 seconds during a scheduled meeting, providing a narrow window for mission success. Captain Morrison, the unit commander who had specifically requested Sarah for this operation, met her at the helicopter as she disembarked. His expression carried the kind of focused intensity that preceded high-stakes missions. But Sarah also detected an undercurrent of uncertainty that suggested complications beyond the standard challenges of precision shooting in a hostile environment. "We have a problem," he said without preamble, gesturing toward the equipment staging area where her shooting kit should have been waiting. "The transport carrying your primary weapon system went down during the approach. No casualties. But your rifle and scope are somewhere in a ravine about 20 kilometers from here." Sarah absorbed this information without visible reaction, her mind already shifting to contingency planning and alternative solutions. Equipment failures and logistical complications were constants in military operations, and her training with damaged and suboptimal gear had prepared her for exactly this kind of situation. "What alternatives are available?" she asked, following Morrison toward a collection of military vehicles and equipment cases that represented the mission's available resources. Morrison opened a weathered equipment case and revealed a rifle that looked like it had survived several deployments without optimal maintenance. The weapon was functional but showed obvious signs of hard use, with scratches on the stock and wear marks on the metal components that spoke to years of field service. The scope mounted on top was an older generation optic that had clearly seen better days, with scuffs on the housing and what appeared to be a significant crack running across the objective lens. "This is what we managed to scrounge from the local supply depot," Morrison explained, his tone apologetic. "The rifle is zeroed, but that scope took damage during a transport accident last week. The armorer says it's still functional, but the optics are compromised. Under normal circumstances, I'd scrub the mission and wait for proper equipment." Sarah lifted the rifle and examined the damaged scope, noting the familiar pattern of fractured glass that created multiple images of distant objects. The crack was more severe than what she'd trained with, but the basic principles remained the same. Through the damaged lens, the world appeared fragmented but still interpretable, with the right techniques and sufficient practice time. "How long do I have to familiarize myself with this system?" she asked, checking the rifle's action and examining the ammunition that had been provided for the mission. Morrison consulted his watch and frowned. 2 hours for range time, then we move to the insertion point. The target window opens at 1,400 hours, which gives us minimal time for preparation and no opportunity for equipment changes. Sarah nodded and shouldered the rifle, feeling the familiar weight and balance that characterized all precision shooting systems regardless of their condition or vintage. The damaged scope would require rapid adaptation, but her months of training with deliberately compromised equipment had prepared her for exactly this scenario. The makeshift range was established in a secure area behind the forward operating base, with targets placed at distances approximating the expected engagement range. Sarah's first shots through the damaged scope confirmed that the weapon was reasonably accurate, though the fractured lens created visual distortions that required careful interpretation and compensation. She spent the first hour mapping the distortion pattern and learning how the crack affected her perception of target placement and environmental conditions. The damage was more extensive than what she'd worked with during training, creating complex visual effects that initially seemed random but gradually revealed predictable patterns that could be used to advantage. Kelly, who had been assigned as her spotter for the mission, watched with obvious concern as Sarah worked through her familiarization process with the damaged equipment. The two women had maintained their partnership following sniper school, developing an effective working relationship that combined Kelly's systematic approach with Sarah's adaptability and unconventional methods. "Are you sure about this?" Kelly asked during a brief break between shooting strings. "The distortion looks pretty severe, and we're not going to get second chances if something goes wrong." Sarah continued her examination of the scope, noting how the crack created reference points that actually enhanced her ability to read wind conditions and estimate ranges. The damage forced her to slow down and be more deliberate with each shot, eliminating any tendency to rush through her shooting sequence or rely on technology rather than fundamental skills. "It's manageable," she replied, settling back into shooting position and engaging a target at the expected mission range. The bullet impacted within inches of her intended point of aim, confirming that accurate shooting was possible despite the equipment limitations. The second hour was devoted to simulating mission conditions as closely as possible, with time pressure, environmental factors, and psychological stress added to the shooting scenario. Sarah's performance remained consistent, demonstrating that her adaptation to the damaged equipment was thorough and reliable under realistic conditions. Captain Morrison observed the final portion of the range session, taking notes on Sarah's performance and consulting with Kelly about her assessment of the equipment limitations and their potential impact on mission success. The conversation was conducted in the clinical tones that military professionals used when evaluating risks and making operational decisions. "Your shooter is confident in her ability to make the shot," Morrison said to Kelly, seeking confirmation from the spotter who would be responsible for target identification and environmental assessment during the actual mission. Kelly hesitated briefly before responding, her professional instincts conflicting with her personal concern for her partner's safety and the mission's success. "She's adapted to the equipment faster than I would have thought possible," she said finally. "If anyone can make this work, it's her, but we're definitely operating outside normal parameters." Morrison nodded and made final notations on his mission planning documents. The decision to proceed with compromised equipment represented a calculated risk based on Sarah's demonstrated ability to excel under challenging conditions and the operational importance of the mission objectives. The insertion phase proceeded without complications, with Sarah and Kelly transported to the designated observation post by a reconnaissance team that had established security and prepared the shooting position. The location provided excellent visibility of the target compound while offering concealment and covered routes for extraction following the engagement. Sarah deployed her equipment methodically, establishing a stable shooting position and configuring her damage scope for the specific conditions and target distance. The crack in the lens was immediately visible through the optic, creating the familiar fragmented view that required careful interpretation but also provided unique advantages for environmental assessment. The target compound appeared peaceful in the afternoon heat, with minimal activity visible and no obvious signs of heightened security or awareness of the approaching threat. Intelligence reports had indicated that the high-value target would appear at a specific location during a scheduled meeting, providing the brief window of opportunity that the mission required. Kelly established her spotting position and began her systematic observation of the target area, using high-powered optics to identify potential threats, assess environmental conditions, and confirm target identification when the moment arrived. Her equipment was undamaged and provided crystal-clear images that contrasted sharply with Sarah's fractured view through the damaged scope. Wind conditions were moderate but variable, with thermal currents created by the sun-heated buildings causing unpredictable air movement that would affect bullet trajectory at the extended engagement range. Sarah used the crack in her scope to detect these subtle wind variations, noting how the distorted images shifted in response to air movement that might have been invisible through clear glass. The waiting period was always the most challenging aspect of precision shooting missions, requiring absolute patience while maintaining perfect readiness to engage when the opportunity presented itself. Sarah controlled her breathing and monitored her physical condition, ensuring that she would be able to execute a perfect shot when the target appeared. At 1,358 hours, Kelly's voice came through their communication system with quiet intensity. Movement in the compound. Multiple individuals approaching the target building from the east. Sarah adjusted her position slightly and confirmed her sight picture through the damaged scope, noting how the afternoon light affected the crack pattern and adjusting her visual interpretation accordingly. The distorted view actually helped her identify subtle movements that might have been missed through undamaged optics. Target identified, Kelly reported moments later. Individual matching the provided description has appeared at the designated location. Range 820 meters. Wind variable, approximately 8 to 12 knots from the southwest. Sarah made final adjustments to her rifle position and sight picture, using the crack in her scope to confirm her wind reading and verify her hold-off calculations. The damaged lens created multiple images of the target, but her trained eye immediately identified the primary image and aligned her reticle accordingly. She controlled her breathing and waited for the optimal moment, monitoring wind conditions through the distorted view and preparing to fire when all variables aligned correctly. The crack in her scope provided additional reference points that helped her detect subtle changes in atmospheric conditions that could affect bullet trajectory. "Shot when ready," Kelly said, confirming that the target remained in position and that conditions were suitable for engagement. Sarah made her final sight adjustments and began her shooting sequence, settling into the perfect stillness that preceded precision shots at extended range. Through the damaged scope, the target appeared fragmented but clearly identifiable, with the crack creating reference lines that confirmed her hold-off calculations. She fired at the bottom of her natural respiratory pause, sending the bullet on its 800-meter journey toward the target. The recoil was absorbed smoothly, allowing her to maintain sight picture and observe the shot's impact through the damaged but functional scope. "Hit confirmed," Kelly reported seconds later, her voice carrying professional satisfaction mixed with obvious relief. "Target down. Immediate extraction recommended." Sarah secured her equipment and prepared for movement, conducting the rapid packing sequence that operational snipers practiced until it became automatic. The damaged rifle and scope were returned to their transport configuration, ready for the extraction movement that would remove the team from the area before enemy forces could respond. The extraction proceeded according to plan, with the reconnaissance team providing security while Sarah and Kelly moved to the designated pickup point. The helicopter insertion was executed smoothly, removing the team from the operational area and returning them to the forward operating base where mission debriefing would be conducted. Captain Morrison was waiting at the landing zone when they returned, his expression indicating satisfaction with the mission results, but also curiosity about how they had achieved success with compromised equipment. The debriefing would cover every aspect of the operation, from equipment performance to tactical procedures and lessons learned for future missions. "Your shot was perfect," he said to Sarah as she secured her equipment and prepared for the administrative processes that followed operational missions. The intelligence reports confirmed that the target was eliminated with no collateral damage and minimal enemy response. "How did you manage such precision with that damaged scope?" Sarah considered the question while completing her equipment checks, reflecting on the months of training and adaptation that had prepared her for exactly this scenario. The damaged scope had required her to rely more heavily on fundamental shooting skills and environmental awareness, ultimately making her a more effective shooter rather than limiting her capabilities. "The damage forced me to slow down and be more deliberate with every aspect of the shot," she explained. "Instead of relying on perfect optics, I had to use multiple sources of information to confirm my calculations and sight picture. In some ways, it actually made me more accurate than I might have been with perfect equipment." Morrison made notes and asked follow-up questions about the specific techniques she had used to compensate for the damaged scope, interested in whether her methods could be taught to other snipers who might encounter similar equipment problems in operational environments. The mission report that Morrison filed following the debriefing included detailed observations about the successful use of damaged equipment and the training techniques that had made such performance possible. The report was circulated among senior commanders and training officials who were responsible for developing sniper capabilities across the Marine Corps. Within weeks, Sarah began receiving requests to conduct training sessions for other sniper teams, sharing her methods for adapting to equipment limitations and developing fundamental skills that didn't depend on perfect conditions or ideal circumstances. The techniques she had developed through necessity became formal training procedures that enhanced the capabilities of Marines throughout the Corps. The original cracked scope had been destroyed in the equipment accident that had initiated this particular mission, but its legacy lived on in the training methods and operational techniques that Sarah had developed through months of adaptation and practice. Her approach had evolved from a personal necessity into a systematic method for developing exceptional marksmanship capabilities regardless of equipment condition or environmental challenges. Years later, as Sarah advanced in rank and responsibility, she continued to emphasize the importance of fundamental skills and adaptability in her training programs and operational planning. The lessons she had learned from a damaged scope had become a core principle of her military philosophy. Excellence didn't require perfect conditions, but it did require perfect preparation and the willingness to adapt to whatever circumstances arose. The story of the cracked scope became part of Marine Corps sniper lore, told in training schools and operational units as an example of how limitations could become advantages when approached with creativity and determination. Sarah's techniques were incorporated into formal training curricula, ensuring that future generations of snipers would be prepared to excel regardless of the challenges they encountered. Sometimes the most valuable lessons came not from success with perfect equipment, but from learning to achieve perfection despite imperfect tools. The cracked scope had taught Sarah that adaptability was more valuable than any piece of equipment, and that the strongest capabilities were those that didn't depend on ideal circumstances to function effectively. Her legacy in the sniper community extended far beyond any single mission or achievement, encompassing a philosophy of excellence that inspired Marines to look beyond their limitations and find advantages in every situation. The crack in a scope had become a crack in conventional thinking, revealing new possibilities for human performance when technology and determination were properly combined. 10 years had passed since the damaged scope first taught Sarah that broken things could still create perfect outcomes. She now stood before a classroom filled with Marine Corps instructors, her colonel's insignia catching the fluorescent light as she prepared to deliver the keynote address at the annual Advanced Marksmanship Symposium. The PowerPoint slide behind her displayed a photograph of that original cracked scope, the spider web fracture pattern preserved forever in digital memory. Below it, statistics showed the measurable improvement in sniper performance across the Corps since her adaptive training methods had been implemented service-wide. Traditional training focused on optimal conditions. Sarah began, her voice carrying the quiet authority that came from years of operational success and instructional experience. We taught Marines to excel when everything worked perfectly. But combat doesn't provide perfect conditions. The audience of seasoned instructors and staff officers listened intently, many of them familiar with the legendary story of the Marine who had turned equipment failure into tactical advantage. Some had served under Sarah's command, others had implemented her training protocols in their own units. All of them understood that they were hearing from someone who had fundamentally changed how the Corps approached precision shooting instruction. Sarah clicked to the next slide, showing before and after performance data from units that had adopted her methods. The improvements were dramatic across every measured category, from accuracy under stress to mission success rates and degraded equipment scenarios. More importantly, casualty rates had decreased as Marines became more adaptable and resourceful in challenging situations. When we started training with deliberately compromised equipment, many people thought we were making things unnecessarily difficult, Sarah continued. But we discovered something unexpected. Marines who learned to excel with broken gear didn't just perform better when their equipment failed, they performed better all the time. A young captain in the front row raised his hand. Colonel Martinez, how do we convince Marines to embrace limitations when they have access to superior technology? Sarah smiled, remembering her own initial resistance to working with damaged equipment years earlier. You don't ask them to embrace limitations. You show them that mastering fundamentals makes them stronger than any piece of equipment ever could. Technology amplifies capability, but it can't replace it. She clicked to a video clip from a recent training exercise, showing Marines successfully engaging targets using scopes that had been deliberately damaged in controlled ways. Their performance was indistinguishable from Marines using perfect equipment, but their confidence and adaptability were visibly superior. The real breakthrough came when we realized that the crack in my scope wasn't teaching me to work around a problem, Sarah explained. It was teaching me to see things that perfect equipment was hiding. Wind patterns, atmospheric variations, subtle target movements. The distortion forced me to pay attention to details that clear optics allowed me to ignore. An instructor from the back of the room called out a question about implementation challenges. How do we scale this approach across the entire Corps without compromising safety or mission effectiveness? Sarah had anticipated this question, having spent years developing the systematic approach that made her methods teachable and repeatable. We start with controlled environments and gradually increase complexity. Marines learn to excel with minor limitations before progressing to more challenging scenarios. By the time they encounter real equipment failures in combat, they've already developed the skills to adapt and overcome. The presentation continued with case studies, training protocols, and implementation guidelines that had been refined through years of practical application. Sarah's methods had evolved far beyond her original adaptation to a single damaged scope, becoming a comprehensive philosophy of military training that emphasized resilience, adaptability, and fundamental skill development. During the question and answer session, a master sergeant asked about the psychological aspects of her training approach. What changes do you see in Marines who go through this program? The question touched on something Sarah had observed consistently throughout her career. Marines who learned to excel with imperfect equipment developed a different relationship with challenges and setbacks. They approached problems with curiosity rather than frustration, seeing obstacles as opportunities to develop new capabilities rather than barriers to success. They become more confident, but also more humble, Sarah replied. Confident because they know they can perform regardless of circumstances. Humble because they've learned that excellence requires constant adaptation and improvement. They stop waiting for perfect conditions and start creating excellent results with whatever they have. As the symposium concluded, several attendees approached Sarah with specific questions about implementing her methods in their units. The conversations continued informally, with experienced instructors sharing their own stories of adaptation and innovation inspired by her example. Colonel Anderson, who had commanded Sarah's first operational unit, waited until the crowd had dispersed before approaching her. "I still remember when you first showed up with that cracked scope," he said with a smile. "Half the battalion thought you were crazy. The other half thought you were showing off." Sarah laughed, remembering her own uncertainty during those early days, when she hadn't been sure whether her unconventional approach would prove effective or career-ending. "I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone else. I was just trying to figure out how to do my job with the equipment I had." "That's what made it work," Anderson replied. "You weren't performing for an audience. You were solving a real problem. And in the process, you solved a bigger problem that the rest of us didn't even know we had." The conversation reminded Sarah of how much had changed since her initial struggles with damaged equipment. What had begun as personal adaptation to overcome a limitation had evolved into institutional transformation that improved capabilities across the entire Marine Corps. Later that evening, Sarah reviewed the feedback forms from the symposium, noting the enthusiasm and commitment that instructors expressed for implementing her training methods in their own programs. The responses confirmed what she had observed throughout her career. Marines were eager to develop capabilities that would make them more effective, especially when those capabilities didn't depend on having perfect equipment or ideal conditions. The cracked scope that had started her journey was long gone, but its influence continued to spread through every Marine who learned that limitations could become advantages when approached with creativity and determination. The techniques Sarah had developed through necessity had become fundamental principles of military training, ensuring that future generations of Marines would be prepared to excel, regardless of the challenges they encountered. Her phone buzzed with a message from Kelly, now a lieutenant colonel commanding her own sniper unit. The text included a photo of a rifle scope with a deliberately created crack, used for training purposes in her advanced marksmanship program. The accompanying message read, "Still teaching Marines that perfect isn't necessary for precision. Thanks for showing us the way." Sarah smiled as she typed a response, knowing that the lesson would continue spreading long after she retired from active duty. The story of the cracked scope had become more than military legend. It was proof that excellence didn't require perfect tools, only perfect dedication to continuous improvement and adaptation. Sometimes the most important discoveries came not from having everything you needed, but from learning to excel with everything you had. The crack in a scope had revealed a crack in conventional thinking, opening new possibilities for human performance that would benefit Marines for generations to come. In conference rooms and training facilities around the world, instructors would continue teaching Sarah's methods, ensuring that her legacy lived on in every Marine who learned to turn limitations into advantages. The broken scope had created something unbreakable, a philosophy of excellence that thrived on challenge and grew stronger through adversity. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.